Sometimes a man loses everything before he finds what truly matters. Elias "Dusty" Vance had been wandering the dusty trails for years, homeless, when news arrived that his estranged uncle had died and left him something, a worthless plot of land in the middle of nowhere. The inheritance was cruel, a rotting shack and a dried-up stone well that hadn't given water in 20 years. The townspeople called him the Baron of Dust and laughed behind his back. But Dusty was desperate and thirsty, so he climbed down into that dark, narrow shaft to dig out the blockage. What his shovel struck wasn't stone. It was something that would change everything. What was buried at the bottom of that forgotten well? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The letter had arrived 3 weeks earlier, forwarded through a chain of post offices that stretched from Denver to Santa Fe, each clerk adding their own scrawl to the envelope until it looked more like a map than a piece of mail. Elias Vance had been sleeping in a stable outside Prescott when the postmaster finally tracked him down, waving the tattered envelope like it was something important. Dusty had taken it with hands that trembled, not from excitement, but from the early stages of dehydration and hunger that had become his constant companions. Inside, a lawyer's dry language informed him that his uncle, Jeremiah Vance, had passed away at the age of 76. The old man had been a prospector, a dreamer, and by all accounts, a fool who'd chased silver and gold across half the Arizona territory without ever finding more than a few flakes. The letter included a deed to 40 acres of scrubland 20 miles outside the boomtown of Copper Ridge, along with whatever structures remained on the property. No cash, no livestock, just dirt and rock and whatever Jeremiah had left behind when his heart finally gave out. Dusty had read the letter 3 times before the full weight of it settled on him. His uncle, his mother's older brother, a man he'd met exactly twice in his life, had remembered him. In a world where Dusty had become invisible, where people looked through him like he was smoke, someone had thought of him at the end. That meant something, even if the inheritance itself meant nothing. He'd been 38 years old when the railroad job ended. A back injury, they said, though Dusty suspected it was more about age than injury. The younger men could work longer hours for less pay, and the foremen had families to think about. Dusty had been alone even then. His wife had left him 5 years prior, taking their daughter to California where her sister lived. The divorce papers had come by mail, signed and official, and Dusty had put his name on them without contest. What could he offer them? A rented room, irregular work, and a future that looked dimmer every year. The descent into homelessness hadn't been dramatic. It was a slow erosion, like water wearing away stone. First the room went, then the regular meals, then the dignity of a clean shirt and a shave. He'd taken work where he could find it, hauling freight, mucking stables, splitting wood. But the jobs got scarcer as his reputation as a drifter spread. Men who lived nowhere were trusted nowhere. He'd learned to sleep light, to move before the sheriff's deputy made his rounds, to stretch a can of beans across 2 days. The other drifters he'd met along the trails had mostly given up on the idea of climbing back up. They'd tell stories about what they used to be. Ranch foremen, railroad engineers, even a former school teacher from St. Louis. But the stories were told like ghost tales, as if those men had died and been replaced by these hollow versions. Dusty had listened to those stories and sworn he wouldn't become one of them. He wouldn't let the dust settle on his soul the way it settled on his clothes. But 3 years of wandering had taught him that willpower alone couldn't change circumstances. The world didn't care about second chances or hard work when you had nothing to work with. Every door that closed made the next one harder to open. Every night spent under stars instead of a roof made him less recognizable as a man who'd once had a trade, a family, a place in the world. When he'd finally made his way to Copper Ridge to claim his inheritance, he'd expected, well, he hadn't known what to expect. Maybe a cabin, perhaps a few fruit trees, possibly even a small spring that could sustain a vegetable garden. The reality had been worse than his lowest expectations. The town itself was thriving, unlike the played-out mining camps Dusty had seen elsewhere. Copper Ridge had struck a rich vein 2 years back. and the population had swelled to nearly 2,000. The main street boasted a proper hotel, 3 saloons, a bank with iron bars on the windows, and a general store that seemed to stock everything from pickaxes to Persian rugs. The wealth was visible in the fresh paint on the buildings, the quality of the horses tied to the rails, the well-dressed men who walked with the confidence of those who knew their prospects were good. Dusty had walked into the land office, wearing his only shirt and trousers, both faded to indeterminate colors by sun and dust. The clerk, a thin man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers, had looked him up and down with barely concealed disdain. "I'm here about the Vance property," Dusty had said, placing the deed on the counter. The clerk had picked it up like it might be contaminated, studied it for a long moment, then actually laughed. "The Vance place? You're Jeremiah's heir?" His nephew. "Well, I'll be." The clerk had called over his shoulder. "Henry, come look at this. We got ourselves the new Baron of Dust." Another clerk had emerged from the back room, and both men had grinned at Dusty like he was a traveling show. The nickname had apparently been Jeremiah's for years, earned through his stubborn insistence that his land would someday prove valuable despite all evidence to the contrary. "That property's 40 acres of hardpan and thistle," the first clerk had said, not unkindly but not kindly either. "The well dried up long before Jeremiah did. Hasn't given water in 2 decades, maybe more. The shack's still standing last I heard, but standing's about all it does. You planning to live out there?" Dusty had taken back the deed and folded it carefully. "It's mine, isn't it?" "Oh, it's yours, all right. Nobody else would have it for free," the clerk had shrugged. "The land office has been trying to get someone to buy the adjacent parcels for a year now. Can't give them away. No water means no crops, no livestock, no nothing. But sure, it's yours. Congratulations on your inheritance." The walk out to the property had taken most of an afternoon. The dirt road from town petered out into a wagon track, then into nothing more than a suggestion of a path through the scrub. The land was everything the clerk had promised: dry, rocky, hostile. A few stubborn mesquite trees clung to life, their roots probably reaching down 20 feet to find moisture. The shack sat at the eastern edge of the property, its roof partially caved in, its walls leaning at angles that defied the usual rules of construction. But it was the well that drew Dusty's attention. It sat about 30 yards from the shack, a circular structure of stacked stones rising 3 feet above the ground. The stones were weathered smooth, ancient-looking, fitted together with the kind of craftsmanship that belonged to an earlier era. Someone had built this well to last, had believed it would serve their family for generations. The wooden cover that should have protected it had long since rotted away, leaving the opening exposed to sun and wind. Dusty had approached it slowly, aware that he was building the moment up in his mind, beyond what it deserved. This was just a dry hole in the ground, nothing more. But it was his dry hole, the first thing he'd owned outright in 3 years. He'd peered over the edge into darkness. The shaft descended straight down, narrow enough that a man would have to keep his arms close to his side. The stones that lined the interior were barely visible in the failing afternoon light, disappearing into black after the first dozen feet. He dropped a pebble and listened. It had taken long enough to hit bottom that Dusty knew this was no shallow well. Whoever had dug it had gone down far, believing that water was there if they just went deep enough. But there had been no splash, no echo of water, just the soft thud of stone striking dried earth. The town's mockery had followed him like a shadow. The general store owner had warned him not to drink all that water at once. When Dusty bought supplies on credit, the bartender at the Lucky Strike Saloon had asked if the Baron of Dust would be hosting a swimming party once he got his fountain flowing. Even the children had picked up the joke, calling after him in the street. Dusty had endured it all with a kind of numb acceptance. This was his life now, owner of 40 acres of dust, resident of a shack that couldn't keep out the wind, beneficiary of his uncle's grand delusions. The only difference between his old homelessness and his new poverty was that now he had an address. But the well had haunted him. In the 3 days since he'd arrived, he'd found himself returning to it repeatedly, staring down into that darkness like it held answers instead of just dried silt. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was the last gasp of hope in a man who'd nearly forgotten what hope felt like. Something about that well wouldn't let him go. On the fourth morning, he'd woken with a fierce thirst that the single canteen of water he'd bought couldn't satisfy. The nearest spring was 5 miles away, and the walk in the June heat would take whatever water he drank and turn it to sweat before he made it back. He'd stood outside the shack, staring at the well again, and a thought had come to him. Simple, desperate, probably foolish. What if the well wasn't dry? What if it was just blocked? The idea seemed to glow in his mind with an intensity that felt almost prophetic. If there was a blockage, collapsed dirt, fallen stones, debris from years of neglect, then maybe there was water underneath. Maybe his uncle hadn't been a complete fool. Maybe this inheritance wasn't entirely worthless. He'd gathered his tools, a shovel, a length of rope he'd found in the shack, a lantern he'd bought on credit. The descent would be dangerous. The shaft was narrow, the depth unknown, and if anything went wrong, no one would find him for days. But dying of thirst in a shack wasn't much better than dying in a well, and at least in the well he'd be doing something. As the sun climbed higher and the heat began to press down like a weight, Elias Dusty Vance tied the rope around his waist, lit the lantern, and lowered himself into the darkness of the stone well that hadn't given water in 20 years. The descent took longer than Dusty had anticipated. Each foothold had to be tested, each stone examined for stability before he trusted his weight to it. The rope around his waist was both comfort and reminder. If he fell, he'd hang, suspended in the shaft like a spider in a web, unable to climb up or down. The lantern swung from his belt, casting wild shadows that made the narrow walls seem to pulse and breathe. 20 feet down, the air changed. It grew cooler, damper, carrying a scent that wasn't quite decay but wasn't freshness either. More like the smell of a root cellar sealed for years. The stones here were covered in a thin film of moisture, which gave Dusty a spark of hope. Moisture meant water was near, even if it wasn't flowing freely. 40 feet down, he found the first sign that something was wrong with this well beyond simple drought. One of the support stones had cracked clean through, and the gap it left showed earth behind it rather than more stone. Wells were supposed to be lined completely, protecting the water source from contamination. But here, the earth itself was visible, as if the well shaft had intersected with something else, another cavity perhaps, or a natural fissure in the rock. 60 feet down, Dusty's boots finally touched bottom. He'd expected solid stone or packed earth. Instead, his feet sank into something soft, not mud exactly, but soil that had been compressed and settled over many years. He lifted the lantern high and examined his surroundings. The bottom of the well wasn't the bottom at all. The shaft continued down, but it had been filled with earth and debris that created a false floor. He could see where water had once pooled, dark, staining on the stones about 3 feet above where he stood, but the chamber itself was dry now, choked with whatever had fallen or been washed down from above. Dusty set the lantern on a narrow ledge and pulled the shovel from where he'd strapped it to his back. If this was a blockage, then clearing it was simply a matter of work. Hard work, yes, and likely futile work. But he'd done plenty of both in his life. The first shovelful of dirt came up easily, light and dry despite the moisture in the air. He tossed it aside and dug again, and again. The repetitive motion was almost meditative. Drive the shovel down, lift, toss, repeat. His back began to ache within minutes, the old railroad injury making itself known. But he pushed through it. Pain was just another constant companion, like hunger and dust. After an hour of digging, he'd created a hole within the well shaft about 2 feet deep. The soil was darker now, heavier, with a clay-like consistency that suggested he was getting deeper into whatever had filled this space. His shirt was soaked through with sweat despite the cool air, and his hands were already forming new blisters on top of old calluses. He paused to rest, sitting on the pile of excavated dirt and wiping his face with his sleeve. The silence down here was profound. No wind, no birds, no voices from the distant town. Just the sound of his own breathing and the occasional drip of water somewhere in the stone above him. It was almost peaceful, this isolation. Down here, no one could see him fail. Down here, The Baron of Dust was just a man with a shovel, trying to find water. When he resumed digging, the shovel blade sank deeper with each thrust. 4 feet down now, then 5. The dirt was becoming harder to extract from the narrow hole, forcing him to work at awkward angles that made his back scream in protest. But he was committed now, driven by the same stubborn streak that had kept him walking when every reasonable voice said to lie down and quit. 6 feet down, his shovel struck something that rang out like a bell. The sound was so unexpected, so completely wrong for dirt and stone, that Dusty actually jumped back. His heart hammered against his ribs as he stared down at the hole he'd created. Metal. That had been metal. He'd worked enough railroad jobs to know the sound of steel on iron. He knelt at the edge of the hole and felt around with his hands, pushing aside the loose dirt until his fingers found it. A smooth, curved surface that was definitely not stone. Cold to the touch, solid, rust-textured but intact. His hands were shaking as he began clearing the dirt more carefully now, using the shovel's edge to scrape rather than dig. Inch by inch, a shape began to emerge. The curve resolved into a dome, then the dome revealed rivets along one edge. This wasn't a natural formation or some random piece of scrap. This was manufactured, purposeful, large. 20 minutes of careful excavation revealed enough for Dusty to understand what he'd found. It was a roof, specifically the iron roof of a stagecoach, the kind the Wells Fargo Company used for their secure transport runs. The metal was pitted with rust and covered in mineral deposits, but the structure was unmistakable. Coaches built for armored transport had reinforced tops to protect against attacks from above, and this one had clearly been designed to last. But how did a stagecoach end up at the bottom of a well? Dusty sat back on his heels, his mind racing. Wells weren't dug around stagecoaches. Stagecoaches didn't sink into the ground and have wells built over them. The only logical explanation was one that seemed impossible. The coach had been here first, buried or hidden or lost, and the well had been dug through whatever had concealed it. Or perhaps the well had already existed when the coach arrived, and it had fallen into some kind of natural cavity beneath the well shaft. His hands found the edges of the roof, following the line of it toward what would have been the front of the vehicle. There, a luggage rail still intact, and there, the mounting bracket for a driver's lamp. Every detail confirmed what he'd found. The implications were staggering. Stagecoaches, especially the armored kind, didn't travel empty. They carried payroll, bank transfers, gold shipments, and if this coach was down here, buried under 60 feet of earth and stone, then whatever it had been carrying was probably still inside. Unless someone had already found it, unless this was just an empty shell, looted decades ago and discarded in this hole. But if it had been found and looted, why fill the well shaft? Why go to such elaborate lengths to hide an empty coach? The effort required to conceal this discovery would have been enormous, digging out the well bottom, repositioning the coach if necessary, filling the shaft with enough dirt to create a false floor. That wasn't the action of someone who'd simply abandoned an empty vehicle. That was the action of someone protecting the secret. Dusty's breath came faster as the full weight of the discovery settled over him. This wasn't just an interesting curiosity. This could be everything. This could be the second chance he'd stopped believing in, but verifying it would require more work. He'd need to clear more dirt, find a way into the coach itself, and see what, if anything, remained inside. And he'd need to do it without telling anyone. The moment word got out that there was something valuable down here, he'd lose it. The law, the town, the land speculators, someone with more power and resources would swoop in and claim it was theirs by right of salvage, or historical precedent, or simple might makes right. No, this secret was his and his alone. The Baron of Dust had just become the guardian of something that might be worth more than all 40 acres of worthless scrubland combined. He cleared more dirt from the coach roof, working with a focused intensity that blocked out pain and fatigue. The metal surface was larger than he'd initially thought. This had been a substantial vehicle, probably capable of carrying 6 passengers inside with more room for cargo on top. His fingers traced the seam where the roof met the side panels, looking for any sign of damage or weakness that might provide an entry point. And then he found it. a section of the roof that had buckled inward, creating a gap just wide enough for a man's arm. The metal was torn, not rusted through, suggesting that whatever force had brought this coach down had been violent. An accident, perhaps, or an attack. Either way, it had created an opening. Dusty worked the edge of the tear with his fingers, bending the metal back slowly to widen the gap. The rust flaked away in his hands, and the screech of metal on metal echoed through the well shaft like a scream. But inch by inch, the opening grew larger. When it was finally big enough, he held the lantern close and peered inside. What he saw there, in the wavering yellow light, made his heart stop and then restart with a thunder that filled his ears. The interior of the coach was packed with wooden crates, stacked floor to ceiling, and stenciled on the side of each crate, still visible despite the years and darkness, were 3 words that changed everything. United States Army. Dusty climbed out of the well in darkness, his muscles trembling with exhaustion and his mind spinning with what he'd discovered. The June stars were sharp and bright overhead, indifferent to the upheaval in the life of one homeless drifter who'd just become something else entirely. Though he wasn't yet sure what. He didn't sleep that night. He sat outside the shack with his back against the wall, watching the well as if it might vanish like a mirage if he looked away. His thoughts ran in circles, always returning to the same central question. How much gold was down there? The stenciling had been clear. United States Army. That meant official cargo, military payroll or supply, funds. And if the coach had been hidden rather than recovered, that suggested the amount was substantial enough to justify the effort. Small shipments wouldn't warrant such elaborate concealment. But substantial could mean many things. $1,000 would be substantial to a man like Dusty. 10,000 would be transformative. 50,000, well, that was the kind of money that changed everything, forever. He forced himself to think practically. The coach had been down there for decades. The style and construction suggested the 1870s or 1880s, which meant at least 40 years, possibly more. Had anyone come looking for it? There must have been an investigation when an army payroll coach went missing. Soldiers would have been dispatched, territories searched, questions asked. But if they'd found it, they'd have retrieved it. The fact that it was still down there meant either no one had known where to look, or the few who did know had kept that knowledge to themselves. Perhaps the original thieves had hidden it, planning to return later and then died or been killed before they could. Or perhaps it had been an accident, the coach falling into some kind of sinkhole or cavern that had then been concealed by subsequent rockfall and erosion. The well itself was the key to the mystery. According to the land office clerk, it had been dry for at least 20 years, but the craftsmanship of the stonework suggested it had been built much earlier, possibly in the territorial days before Arizona became a state. Someone had invested significant labor into that well, which meant at some point it had provided water, good water, reliable water. What if the well had been deliberately sabotaged? What if whoever hid the coach had collapsed the water table to ensure the property became worthless, driving away any potential discoverers? The thought made a grim kind of sense. Kill the well, kill the value of the land. Ensure no one has reason to dig deep or investigate too closely. It was brilliant in its simplicity and ruthless in its execution. As dawn broke and light began to paint the eastern sky in shades of gold and rose, Dusty made his decision. He would open one of the crates, just one, to verify what he'd found. No sense in planning how to spend money he didn't actually have. The army stenciling might mean nothing. The crates could be filled with paperwork or spoiled provisions or equipment rendered worthless by time and moisture, but he had to know. The descent in daylight was easier, but no less treacherous. His muscles protested every movement, stiff from yesterday's exertion, but he forced them to cooperate. The rope and lantern were waiting where he'd left them, and within 20 minutes he was back at the bottom of the well, staring at the torn opening in the stagecoach roof. Getting inside required widening the gap further. Dusty worked carefully, using a piece of iron pipe he'd found in the shack to lever the bent metal away. From the frame, the screech of tearing iron set his teeth on edge, but eventually the opening was large enough for him to squeeze through. He dropped feet first into the coach interior, landing awkwardly on the stack of crates. The space was cramped and dark despite the lantern, the air thick with dust and the musty smell of old wood. His light revealed details he'd missed the night before, the leather seats torn and rotted, the interior fittings tarnished black, and everywhere the fine grey powder of disintegrated fabric and paper. The crates themselves were surprisingly intact. Made from thick hardwood and bound with iron straps, they had been built to withstand rough handling and harsh conditions. Each one was approximately 2 feet square and bore the same army stencil along with additional markings. Lot numbers, dates, and the words Fort Huachuca to Fort Whipple. Dusty knew those names. Fort Huachuca was down in the southern part of the territory. Fort Whipple up near Prescott. The route between them would have been several days' travel through some of the roughest country in Arizona. Perfect territory for ambush or accident. He selected a crate from the middle of the stack, reasoning that if looters had been here, they'd have taken the top ones first. The iron straps were corroded but still strong, requiring significant force to pry loose. When they finally gave way with a sharp crack, Dusty held his breath. The lid came free, and he lifted the lantern close. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow remained intact, was a strong box, smaller than the crate, made of iron, with a heavy padlock securing the hasp. The metal was pitted and stained, but the lock still held firm. Dusty lifted it out carefully. It was remarkably heavy for its size, perhaps 30 pounds. He set it on the pile of crates and examined it more closely. No manufacturer's mark was visible, no serial number or identification. Just solid iron and a lock that had been designed to resist casual tampering. The weight distribution suggested the contents were dense and probably metal. Coins. It had to be coins. Paper currency wouldn't have lasted. Not in these conditions, but gold and silver would endure indefinitely, unaffected by moisture or time. Dusty tried the lock with his fingers, knowing it was futile but unable to resist. The mechanism was frozen solid, immune to any attempt at picking even if he'd had the tools and skill. Breaking it would require a hammer and chisel, neither of which he'd thought to bring down the well with him. He forced himself to take inventory instead of rushing back up to get tools. Moving carefully around the cramped interior, he counted the crates, 32 in total, stacked in 4 rows of 8. If each crate contained a strongbox similar to the one he'd opened, and if each strongbox held a comparable amount of gold, he stopped that line of thinking. Speculation was pointless until he knew for certain. But even as he tried to rein in his imagination, his hands were shaking as he hoisted the strongbox onto his shoulder and prepared to climb back up the rope. The ascent was brutal with the added weight. Twice he had to stop and rest, wedging himself against the stones while his arms recovered. But eventually he emerged into the brilliant Arizona sunlight, the strongbox clutched to his chest like it was made of glass rather than iron. He carried it into the shack and set it on the floor in the corner farthest from the door. Then he stood there, staring at it, aware that the next few minutes would determine everything. If the box was full of gold, his life changed. If it was empty or filled with something worthless, he was still the Baron of Dust, with nothing but a mystery and a lot of hard work ahead. Dusty found the hammer and chisel in the pile of tools his uncle had left behind. He positioned the chisel against the lock's hasp, raised the hammer, and brought it down with all the force of a man who'd been waiting his whole life for a break. The lock held for 3 strikes, then shattered with a crack that sounded like a gunshot in the small shack. Pieces of metal scattered across the floor and the hasp swung free. Dusty's hands trembled as he lifted the lid of the strongbox, the old hinges protesting with a shriek. Gold. The word seemed inadequate for what he was looking at. Rows of coins, each one catching the morning light that filtered through the gaps in the shack's walls. $20 gold pieces, double eagles, packed so tightly they barely shifted when he tilted the box. His fingers reached out to touch them, half expecting them to vanish like everything else good in his life had vanished. But they were solid, real, heavy in his palm when he lifted one free and held it up to examine. The coin showed Lady Liberty on one side, an eagle on the other, and the date, 1879, 46 years old, and it looked like it had been minted yesterday. Dusty's breath came in short gasps as he began counting. The coins were arranged in rolls, each one wrapped in what had once been paper but was now brittle fragments. 5 coins to a roll, he quickly determined. 10 rolls across, 6 rows deep, 300 coins in this single strong box. $320 gold pieces, $6,000 in one box. He sat back hard on the dirt floor, the strong box between his knees. $6,000 was more money than he'd earned in the last 5 years combined. It was a house, a business, a future. It was everything he'd lost and more. And if the other 31 crates held similar strong boxes, the mathematics made him dizzy. 32 boxes times $6,000, $192,000. The number was so large it seemed meaningless, like trying to count stars or measure the ocean. But then reality began to intrude on the euphoria. This was Army gold, military property. Technically, it still belonged to the United States government. Finding it didn't make it his any more than finding a lost dog made you its owner. The law would have something to say about this, and lawyers, and probably politicians. And even if he had some legal claim, finder's rights or salvage laws or whatever might apply, how did he turn gold coins into cash without raising questions? He couldn't exactly walk into a bank with a strong box full of double eagles and expect no one to wonder where a homeless drifter got his hands on $6,000 in antique gold. The smart thing would be to report it. Contact the authorities, explain what he'd found, and hope they gave him some kind of reward. But Dusty had lived long enough to know that the smart thing and the right thing often parted ways when large sums of money were involved. The government would take the gold, certainly. They might give him something for his trouble, maybe 5%, maybe 10% if he was lucky. That would still be substantial, enough to get him back on his feet. But it wouldn't be transformative. It wouldn't erase the 3 years of homelessness or the 5 years before that of watching his life fall apart, piece by piece. It wouldn't give him back the wife who'd left or the daughter who'd stopped writing. It wouldn't restore the man he'd been before the world taught him that dignity was a luxury he couldn't afford. This gold, though, all of it, claimed and kept secret. This could do all that and more. Dusty closed the strongbox carefully and pushed it back into the corner. He needed time to think, to plan. The discovery had to stay secret, at least until he figured out how to handle it. That meant continuing to live as the Baron of Dust, enduring the town's mockery, maintaining the appearance of a man with nothing. He forced himself to eat the stale bread and beans that constituted his breakfast, though his stomach was in knots. Then he walked out to examine the property with new eyes. 40 acres of scrub land, a collapsed shack, and a dry well, that's what everyone saw. But underneath was nearly $200,000 in gold, and somehow he had to figure out how to claim it without losing it. The first problem was practical. Retrieving the rest of the strong boxes. 31 more crates to open, 31 more boxes to haul up 60 feet of well shaft. The physical labor alone would take weeks, and doing it without being observed would be nearly impossible during daylight hours. The property was isolated, yes, but not invisible. Anyone with a telescope from town could watch him working, and questions would follow. Night work, then. He'd have to do it all after dark, which would be slower and more dangerous but necessary. And he'd need somewhere to hide the gold once he retrieved it. The shack wouldn't do. Too obvious, too vulnerable. He'd need to dig a cache somewhere on the property, somewhere that wouldn't be discovered even if people came looking. The second problem was more complex. What to do with the gold once he had it? Melting it down would destroy its value. Collectors paid premiums for old coins, especially ones in good condition. But selling them through normal channels would create a paper trail that led straight back to him. He'd need a middleman, someone who could move the coins quietly without asking too many questions. That meant finding someone trustworthy, which was perhaps the hardest part of all. Trust required either long acquaintance or mutually assured destruction, and Dusty had neither. Any contact he made would have leverage over him the moment they knew what he had. He spent the afternoon walking the property, ostensibly examining the land, but actually planning his next moves. The well needed to look untouched from a distance. He'd need to rig the rope so he could lower and raise it quickly, and he'd need a cover story for why he was spending so much time out here alone. The cover story, at least, was easy. He'd tell anyone who asked that he was trying to clear the well in hopes of finding a spring. Everyone in town already thought he was a fool for trying, so the story would be perfectly believable. Let them laugh at the Baron of Dust digging in his worthless hole. Their mockery was the perfect camouflage. As the sun began to set and the temperature finally dropped from scorching to merely hot, Dusty made a decision. He would retrieve one more strongbox tonight, just to verify that the first one wasn't an anomaly. If the second box held similar contents, then he'd know the full scope of what he'd found and could plan accordingly. But before that, he needed to solve the immediate problem of food and water. His supplies were nearly exhausted, and he'd need his strength for the nights of work ahead. That meant going into town, which meant facing the mockery again, which meant swallowing his pride and playing the part of the defeated drifter. He cleaned himself up as best he could with a rag and the last of his water. The gold coin he'd examined earlier was still in his pocket, warm against his thigh. He took it out and looked at it one more time in the fading light. Lady Liberty stared back at him, her profile serene and confident, as if she knew secrets that lesser mortals could only guess at. Dusty put the coin back in his pocket and started the long walk toward Copper Ridge. The Baron of Dust had business in town, and if people wanted to laugh at him, he'd let them. Every minute they spent laughing was a minute they weren't suspecting the truth. And the truth was that the poorest man in town had just become, secretly, one of the richest men in the territory. The general store was busy when Dusty arrived, filled with miners fresh off their shifts and ranch hands picking up supplies. The proprietor, a heavy-set man named Hoskins, spotted him immediately and called out loud enough for everyone to hear, "Well, if it isn't the Baron himself, come to buy a bucket for all that water you're gonna..." "Strike!" Laughter rippled through the store. Dusty kept his expression neutral and made his way to the counter. "Need supplies on credit," he said quietly. "Beans, flour, bacon, I can work it off." Hoskins scratched his chin, making a show of considering it. "Work it off doing what? Digging in that dry hole of yours?" More laughter from the miners. "Tell you what, I'll extend you credit, but only because I feel sorry for you. Because your uncle always paid his debts, even if he was crazy as a bedbug." "Jeremiah wasn't crazy," said a voice from the back of the store. An old man emerged from between the shelves, his face weathered like old leather, his eyes sharp despite his years. He just believed in that land when nobody else did. Dusty recognized him. Samuel Pritchard, one of the original settlers of Copper Ridge, old enough to remember when the town was just a trading post and 3 tents. He walked with a cane, but carried himself with the kind of dignity that came from having seen everything and being impressed by none of it. "No offense meant, Sam," Hoskins said quickly. "Just having a bit of fun with our new landowner here." Pritchard waved a dismissive hand. "Fun's fine when it's funny. Kicking a man when he's down is just mean." He turned to Dusty. "You really trying to clear that well?" "Yes, sir," Dusty said. "Figure there's no harm in trying. More harm than you know, maybe." Pritchard's eyes had gone distant, like he was looking at something only he could see. "That well's got a story, son. Not a good one." The store had gone quiet. Even Hoskins was listening now, his mockery forgotten. Stories from Sam Pritchard were rare enough to command attention. "My father was here when they dug that well," Pritchard continued. "Back in 1878 it was. Man named Marcus Kellerman owned the land then. Bought it thinking he'd start a ranch. Hired a crew of diggers, and they went down deep looking for water. Found it too at about 60 feet. Sweet water, cold and clean. Marcus built himself a house, started running cattle. Had the best water source for 20 miles in any direction." Dusty's pulse quickened. 1878, a year before the coins were dated. "What happened to him?" "That's the strange part," Pritchard said. "One day in the summer of 1880, the well just dried up. Overnight, near as anyone could tell. Marcus went down to check it. Said it was like the earth had swallowed the water whole. He tried digging deeper, but all he found was dirt and rock. No spring, no seepage, nothing. The cattle started dying, and Marcus couldn't afford to haul water from town. He sold out to your uncle for almost nothing and left the territory. Never heard from him again." "And Uncle Jeremiah never got the water flowing again," Dusty said. "Never did, but Lord knows he tried. Spent near 30 years convinced it would come back." Pritchard shook his head. "Some folks said the well was cursed. Others said it was just bad luck, but I always wondered if there was more to it. Wells don't just dry up like that, not good ones dug into solid water table. Something happened down there. Dusty bought his supplies and left with Pritchard's words echoing in his mind. 1880, the same year the stagecoach had presumably been hidden. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. Somehow the concealment of the coach was connected to the destruction of the well. He found Pritchard sitting on a bench outside the general store, whittling a piece of wood into what looked like a bird. The old man glanced up as Dusty approached. "You want to know more?" Pritchard said. It wasn't a question. "I do." "Sit down then. My feet are tired from all that standing." Dusty sat, arranging his small bag of supplies at his feet. The evening was settling in, painting the sky in shades of amber and purple. The town was quieting down, miners heading to the saloons, families heading home. "There's something else about that summer," Pritchard said, his knife moving in slow, practiced strokes. "Something most folks have forgotten or never knew. There was an army payroll coach went missing around that same time. Big news back then. Cavalry from Fort Huachuca came through asking questions, searching everywhere. They had a description of the coach and the route it should have taken. Never found a trace." Dusty kept his voice steady. "How much was on it?" "Depends on who you asked. Official number was $30,000, meant to pay 6 months' wages for all the troops at Fort Whipple. But rumors said it was more than that. Maybe double, maybe triple. Army was fighting the Apache Wars back then. Had troops spread all over the territory. That's a lot of payroll to lose." Pritchard paused in his whittling. Some said the coach was ambushed by bandits. Others said it fell into a ravine or sinkhole. Few folks whispered that the soldiers themselves stole it and deserted. Nobody ever proved nothing. "Why are you telling me this?" Dusty asked. Pritchard looked at him directly. "Because you got an honest face, son. And because that well of yours sits right on the old territorial road that coaches used to take between the forts. And because I seen you walk into town twice now, and both times you looked like a man carrying a secret that's too heavy to hold alone." Dusty's blood went cold. "I don't know what you mean." "Don't you?" Pritchard returned to his whittling. "I'm 83 years old. I've seen men find silver, gold, copper, and every other kind of treasure this territory has to offer. And I've seen what that finding does to them. Changes their walk, changes their eyes. Makes them careful in ways they weren't careful before." He held up the wooden bird, examining it in the fading light. "I'm not asking what you found. That's your business. But I will tell you this. Whatever it is, it'll bring you more trouble than you can imagine if you're not smart about it. And if I wanted to be smart about it," Dusty said slowly, "what would you suggest?" Pritchard smiled, and it transformed his weathered face into something almost youthful. "First thing, don't trust anybody. Second thing, remember that gold gets heavier the longer you carry it. And third thing," he handed the wooden bird to Dusty, "sometimes the best treasure isn't the one you keep, but the one that lets you become who you're supposed to be." Dusty looked down at the carving. It was a sparrow, wings spread as if in flight, every feather detailed with care. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me yet. You haven't walked the hard road that's coming." Pritchard stood up slowly, using his cane for support. "But when you do walk it, remember, there's folks in this town who aren't as cruel as they seem. We've all been down at some point. Some of us remember what it's like to need a hand up instead of a boot down." He walked away into the gathering darkness, leaving Dusty alone with his supplies, his secrets, and the growing realization that keeping those secrets might be the hardest work he'd ever done. Over the next week, Dusty established a routine that to any observer would seem like the futile efforts of a desperate man. Each morning he'd emerge from the shack and spend an hour or two working around the well in plain view, clearing brush, organizing stones, generally appearing to prepare for a major excavation effort that everyone knew would yield nothing. But the real work happened at night. Once darkness fell and the distant lights of Copper Ridge became the only evidence of civilization, Dusty would descend into the well and spend hours hauling up strong boxes. Each one was a brutal test of strength and determination. Each one contained the same treasure: $320 gold pieces, $6,000 in weight and metal and possibility. By the end of the week, he'd retrieved 8 more strong boxes, bringing his total to 9. $54,000, hidden in a shallow cache he'd dug beneath the floorboards of the shack. The physical labor had left him leaner and harder, his muscles adapting to the constant strain. but it was the mental weight that threatened to break him. Every coin he retrieved felt like another link in a chain connecting him to a crime he hadn't committed, but from which he was profiting. The army had never recovered this gold. Families had probably suffered because wages went unpaid. Soldiers had gone without their due, and now a homeless drifter was secretly becoming rich off their loss. The thoughts plagued him during the quiet hours, when exhaustion should have brought sleep, but instead brought only restless contemplation. Was he any better than a thief? The gold wasn't his by any reasonable measure. He'd simply stumbled upon it through accident and desperation. Taking it felt less like salvage and more like grave robbing, even though no one had died in the well as far as he could determine. But then he'd remember the 3 years of homelessness, the casual cruelty of strangers, the way society had discarded him like waste. He'd remember applying for jobs and being turned away before he could even explain his qualifications. He'd remember eating from trash bins behind restaurants, sleeping in ditches, being moved along by deputies who treated him like vermin. The world hadn't shown him mercy. Why should he show mercy to a system that had taken everything from him? The internal argument went round and round, never resolving, always present. By day, he played the Baron of Dust, accepting the town's mockery with patience that looked like defeat. By night, he was something else. A man transforming himself one strong box at a time, building a future from the ruins of the past. On the 8th morning, as Dusty was hauling water from the town pump, he noticed a stranger watching him from outside the land office. The man was in his 40s, well dressed in a suit that had seen better days, with the kind of observant eyes that marked him as either a lawman or a gambler. When their gazes met, the stranger smiled and walked over. "Elias Vance?" he asked, extending a hand. "My name is Thomas Garrett. I'm a historical researcher working on a book about the territorial period." Dusty shook the offered hand cautiously. "I'm Vance. I heard you inherited the old Kellerman place. Fascinating piece of history, that property. I was hoping you might allow me to conduct a survey of the land. Strictly academic, of course. I'm particularly interested in the old territorial road that used to run through there." Every instinct Dusty had developed in 3 years of survival screamed warning. "What kind of survey?" "Oh, nothing invasive. Just walking the property, taking measurements, perhaps some photographs. I'm documenting the infrastructure of the territorial period. Roads, wells, way stations. Your well is particularly interesting because of its age and construction style. Might I see it?" "It's just a dry hole," Dusty said. "Nothing special about it. Perhaps not to you, but to a historian. Every detail matters. The stonework alone could tell us about the builders, the period, the techniques they used." Garrett's smile remained friendly, but his eyes were calculating. "I'd be happy to pay for the privilege. Say $20 for an afternoon's access." $20. A fortune to the man Dusty was supposed to be. Refusing it would seem suspicious, would mark him as someone who had reasons to keep people away from his property. "Make it 30, Dusty said, "and you can have 2 hours, but you don't touch nothing and you don't come back without asking first." "Deal." Garrett pulled out a leather wallet and counted out the bills. "How about tomorrow afternoon? I'll need good light for the photographs." Dusty took the money and nodded. 2 o'clock. Don't be late." He watched Garrett walk away, the man's confident stride suggesting he'd gotten exactly what he wanted. The money felt heavy in Dusty's pocket, not because of its weight, but because of what accepting it meant. He'd just sold access to his secret, even if Garrett didn't know what he was really looking for. That night, Dusty didn't go into the well. Instead, he sat outside the shack and thought through every possible scenario. Garrett could be exactly what he claimed, a historian interested in old roads and wells. But he could also be a treasure hunter, someone who'd heard the old stories about the missing payroll coach and made connections that others had missed. The timing of the well's failure and the coach's disappearance were public record, available to anyone willing to dig through old newspapers and territorial archives. A smart researcher could piece together the possibility that they were connected. And if Garrett had done that research, then his friendly offer was really reconnaissance, a way to get close and observe whether Dusty was acting like a man who'd found something valuable. Dusty looked out at the well, its stone circle barely visible in the starlight. He'd retrieved 9 strong boxes out of 32, $54,000. If he stopped now, that would be enough to start over, to buy a small place somewhere else and live quietly. He could abandon the rest, walk away clean before Garrett or anyone else got too curious. But the remaining 23 boxes held $138,000. That was the difference between comfortable and wealthy, between starting over and never having to worry again. It was enough to find his daughter in California, to arrive not as a broken man begging forgiveness, but as a father who'd finally become someone worthy of her time. The risk was growing with each day, with each person who looked at him too long or asked too many questions. But the reward was also growing, accumulating in the darkness beneath the earth like interest on a deposit he'd never made. Dusty went into the shack and pulled up one of the floorboards, revealing the strong boxes stacked below. He'd been so careful about hiding them, arranging the dirt to look undisturbed, memorizing exactly how everything appeared so he could detect any tampering. But now he realized his mistake. He'd been thinking like a homeless man protecting scraps, not like a wealthy man securing a fortune. If Garrett was who Dusty suspected, then the researcher would be looking for signs of recent excavation, changes in the property's appearance, anything that suggested Dusty had found what everyone else had missed. The 9 strong boxes represented evidence that could destroy him if discovered. He needed a better hiding place, something that would survive even a thorough search. And he needed it before tomorrow afternoon when Thomas Garrett came walking onto the property with his camera and his questions and his eyes that missed nothing. Dusty spent the entire night relocating the strong boxes. He couldn't take them far, not with 9 boxes weighing 30 pounds each, but he could move them off the property entirely. A quarter-mile to the west, a rocky outcrop created a natural shelter where erosion had carved shallow caves into the hillside. He carried the boxes one at a time, covering his tracks as best he could in the darkness, and stashed them deep in the largest cave. By the time the sun rose, he was exhausted but satisfied. The shack was empty except for his few personal possessions. The cache beneath the floorboards looked undisturbed. If Garrett searched, and Dusty was certain he would, he'd find nothing but a homeless man's meager belongings. Garrett arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, carrying a leather satchel and a bulky camera on a tripod. He wore different clothes today, practical canvas trousers and a work shirt. And his friendly smile seemed more genuine in the afternoon light. "Beautiful property," he said, looking around at the scrubland and rocks. "Harsh, but beautiful. I can see why someone would want to make a home here. My uncle thought so," Dusty said. "Didn't work out for him." "Ah, yes. Jeremiah Vance. I did some research on him. Prospector, mostly unsuccessful but persistent. Owned this land for nearly 30 years. Garrett set down his equipment and pulled out a notebook. "Mind if I start with some questions? That's not what you paid for. You said you wanted to survey the land." "You're right. My apologies." "Professional habit. I always want to know the story before I examine the evidence." Garrett smiled again. "Show me this famous well of yours." They walked to the well together, Garrett keeping up a running commentary about the geology of the area and the difficulty of finding reliable water sources in the Arizona Territory. Dusty let him talk, watching for any sign that the friendliness was a mask over something more calculating. At the well, Garrett spent several minutes examining the stonework, running his hands over the ancient joints, peering down into the darkness. He took measurements with a length of string and noted them in his book. Then he set up his camera and took photographs from multiple angles, the flash powder creating brief moments of brilliant light. "Remarkable craftsmanship," Garrett said, studying the stones again. "This wasn't built by amateurs. Someone knew what they were doing, probably Mexican or Indian laborers who'd learned the old techniques. See how the stones are fitted? No mortar, just perfect placement and weight distribution. This well was built to last centuries." "Didn't last long enough to keep giving water," Dusty observed. "Yes, about that." Garrett straightened up and brushed dust from his hands. "You said you've been trying to clear it. Any luck?" "Some. Got about 6 feet of silt cleared out. Nothing but more dirt underneath." "Interesting. You know, there's something peculiar about this well." Garrett pulled out what looked like a surveyor's map from his satchel. "According To the territorial records, the original well on this property was documented as being 75 feet deep when it was completed in 1878. That's remarkably deep for a hand-dug well. Most people stop at 40 or 50 feet. But 75 feet would put the bottom well below the usual water table, which suggests whoever dug it was either very ambitious or very certain there was something specific they were looking for. Dusty kept his expression neutral. You can't always trust old records. True, but there's something else. Garrett unfolded the map completely, revealing a detailed survey of the property and surrounding area. Red marks indicated various features, and Dusty's well was circled in heavy ink. I've been researching the missing payroll coach I mentioned yesterday. Yes, I know I said I was just a historian, but I confess I have a particular interest in that case. It's one of the great unsolved mysteries of the territorial period. Why tell me this? Dusty's hand moved unconsciously toward his pocket, where he'd been carrying one of the gold coins for days now like a talisman. Because I think you deserve to know what you've found. Garrett met his eyes directly. That coach didn't just disappear. According to the investigation reports, there were indications it had been driven off the road near here. Broken brush, wheel marks leading toward what was then just empty land. But the trail went cold. No wreckage, no bodies, no gold. Just vanished. Maybe it went somewhere else. Maybe. But here's what I find fascinating. The well on this property went dry in the summer of 1880, just weeks after the coach disappeared. Before that, it had been one of the most reliable water sources in the region. After that, bone dry. Permanently. Garrett tapped the map. What if the well didn't dry up? What if it was deliberately sabotaged to hide something? Dusty's heart was pounding, but he forced himself to stay calm. That's quite a story. It is. And here's another interesting detail. Garrett reached into his satchel again and pulled out a folded piece of aged paper. This is a copy of the original survey, done when Marcus Kellerman bought this land. Look at the notes here. Dusty leaned in to read the faded writing. The surveyor had noted the well's depth, its output, and its construction, all standard information. But there was an additional note in smaller writing. Natural cavity, approx. 50 feet depth, well shaft intersects. Recommend full investigation before completion. Natural cavity. Garrett said softly. The well wasn't just a well. It connected to something else underneath, probably a sinkhole or limestone cave. That kind of feature would make the well's construction much more difficult, but it would also create a perfect hiding place for something large, like a stagecoach. The silence stretched between them. Dusty could hear his own breathing, loud in his ears. Garrett knew. He'd pieced it together from old records and geological surveys and historical research. The question was, what he planned to do with that knowledge. Let me be direct, Garrett said finally. I'm not after the gold for myself. I'm a historian, not a treasure hunter. What I want is the story. The truth about what happened to that coach and the men who were guarding it. If the gold is down there, it belongs to the government legally. But finding it would answer questions that have haunted this territory for 45 years. And if someone already found it, Dusty asked carefully, then that someone would have a difficult decision to make. The law would say the gold must be returned, but the law rarely accounts for circumstances. For a man who's lost everything and stumbled upon a second chance through no action of his own, beyond desperation and hard work. Garrett folded up the map and put it away. I've been researching this mystery for 3 years. I know more about it than anyone living, and I'm willing to help the person who found it navigate the complicated situation they're in exchange for what? The truth. Access to the site. Photographs and documentation for my book. And perhaps, if there's a legal way to arrange it, a finder's fee that's fair and proper. Garrett extended his hand. I'm not your enemy, Mr. Vance, but I am the only person who can help you keep what you've found without going to prison for it. Dusty didn't take the offered hand. I need time to think, of course, but don't take too long. Other people are starting to notice things. The way you've been buying supplies, the way you work only at night when you think no one's watching. Copper Ridge is a small town, Mr. Vance. Secrets don't keep well here. Garrett picked up his camera and equipment. I'll be at the hotel for the next 3 days. Room 7. When you're ready to talk, and I believe you will be, come find me. We can solve this together, or it can solve itself in ways neither of us will like. He walked away, leaving Dusty standing beside the well with his mind racing. Everything had changed in the space of 30 minutes. His secret wasn't secret anymore. His plan, such as it was, lay in ruins. And the man who held his future in his hands was a stranger with a notebook and a camera, and promises that might be genuine or might be the most sophisticated trap Dusty had ever seen. He looked down into the darkness of the well, that familiar abyss that had become the center of his world. 23 strong boxes still waited below, $138,000 in gold that would either save him or destroy him. The time for hiding was over. Now came the time for decisions that would define the rest of his life. Dusty didn't sleep that night either. He lay on the cot in the shack and stared at the ceiling, watching shadows from the moonlight shift across the warped boards. Every option he considered led to complications, and every complication multiplied into a dozen more. Trust Garrett, and he might be walking into a trap. The historian could be working with the law, using their conversation as evidence to build a case for theft of government property. Dusty would be arrested, the gold confiscated, and he'd end up worse than when he started. Don't trust Garrett, and he risked someone else discovering the truth through different means. The historian wasn't wrong. Copper Ridge was small, and Dusty's nocturnal activities had probably been noticed by more people than just him. If someone else made the connection, they might not be as interested in historical accuracy or fair finder's fees. Or he could take what he'd already hidden and run. $54,000 was enough to disappear, to start over in California or Oregon or anywhere far from Arizona and its territorial ghosts. But running meant abandoning the rest of the gold, and more importantly, it meant living the remainder of his life looking over his shoulder, waiting for the law to catch up. By morning, he'd made his decision. It wasn't a good decision, but it was the only one that offered any chance of legitimacy. He would talk to Garrett. He would hear the man out, and if the proposal seemed genuine, he would consider partnership over prison. He cleaned himself up as best he could, changing into his least worn shirt and running his fingers through his hair in place of a proper combing. Then he walked to town, arriving at the hotel just after breakfast. The clerk directed him to room 7 without question, as if Garrett had told him to expect a visitor. Garrett answered the door still in his nightshirt, his hair mussed and his eyes slightly bleary, but he smiled when he saw Dusty and stepped aside to let him in. "I hoped you'd come. Coffee, please." The room was modest but comfortable, with papers spread across every surface. Maps, photographs, handwritten notes. Garrett poured coffee from a pot on the small stove and handed Dusty a cup that was chipped but clean. "I've been working on this case for 3 years, Garrett said, gesturing at the papers. "Started as a footnote in my research on territorial transportation routes, but it became an obsession. $30,000 in Army gold, vanished without a trace. 6 soldiers who were either killed or deserted, depending on which theory you believe, and a mystery that's haunted this region ever since." Dusty sipped the coffee. It was strong and bitter, the kind that cleared cobwebs from the mind. Why obsessed? Because mysteries like this don't just disappear. Someone knows something. Someone always knows something. The question is whether they're alive to tell it, and whether they're willing. Garrett sat down on the edge of the bed. "When I heard about your uncle's property and started researching its history, the pieces began to fall into place. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. Let's say you're right," Dusty said carefully. "Let's say the coach is down. There, and let's say someone found it. What exactly are you proposing?" Garrett stood and moved to the table, shuffling through papers until he found what he was looking for. A legal document, several pages long, covered in dense text. "This is a salvage contract I had a lawyer in Tucson draft. It's based on maritime law, which has the most established precedents for finding and claiming lost property. The principle is simple. The finder has rights to what they recover, but those rights are balanced against the original owner's claim." "The government's claim," Dusty said. "Exactly. But here's the key. After 45 years, the government's claim is weakened. They've made no active effort to recover the gold in decades. They've written it off in their books. Under salvage law, that abandonment strengthens the finder's position considerably." Garrett pointed to a section in the middle of the document. "This contract proposes that the finder keeps 60% of whatever's recovered. The government gets 40%. The historian, that's me, gets nothing except the right to document and publish the find. 60%, Dusty did the math quickly. If all 32 strong boxes held gold, that was nearly $192,000. 60% would be just over $115,000. Still a fortune. Still transformative. But 40%, $77,000, would go back to the government. That's a lot to give up. It's a lot to keep out of prison, Garrett countered. And more than that, it's legal, defensible in court. With proper documentation and legal representation, this find could be processed through legitimate channels. No hiding, no running, no wondering when the law will catch up. You really think the government would agree to this? I think they'd rather recover 40% of something than 100% of nothing. And I think the publicity of solving a 45-year mystery would be worth the compromise. This would be national news. The territorial coach that vanished reappears through the diligence of a determined researcher and the good fortune of a local landowner. It's a story that sells newspapers and makes careers. Dusty set down his coffee cup. And what's stopping me from taking all of it and leaving you with nothing? Garrett smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Several things. First, I've documented my research extensively. If you disappear with the gold, my documentation becomes evidence in a criminal case, rather than a historical curiosity. Second, I've already contacted a lawyer in Tucson who specializes in salvage law. He knows I'm pursuing this case. If something happens to me or if I suddenly stop communicating, he has instructions. Third, he paused, his expression softening. I don't think you're the kind of man who would do that. I've watched you these past weeks. You're not a thief, Mr. Vance. You're a man who's had a run of terrible luck and found an opportunity to change that. There's a difference. The words hit Dusty harder than he expected. He'd spent so many years being treated as less than human that being recognized as decent felt almost painful. How would this work? Step by step. First, we verify what's down there. A full inventory, photographed and documented. I'll need access to the well and whatever you've already recovered. Garrett watched Dusty's face carefully. Second, we contact the lawyer in Tucson and begin the legal process. He files the claim on your behalf, with me as supporting witness. Third, we negotiate with the government, probably through the Department of the Army, possibly involving the territorial governor. Fourth, once terms are agreed, the gold is recovered officially, transported to a bank, and divided according to the contract. How long? 6 months, maybe a year. These things move slowly, but during that time you'd have legal protection. The claim would be on record, your rights established. No one could simply take it from you. Dusty stood and walked to the window, looking out at the main street of Copper Ridge. The town was going about its business, miners heading to their shifts, merchants opening their stores, horses tied to rails waiting patiently for their riders. Normal life, the kind he'd been excluded from for too long. I've already taken 9 strong boxes, he said quietly. $54,000 in gold coins dated 1879, 300 coins per box, each one a $20 double eagle. They're hidden off the property where no one will find them. He heard Garrett's sharp intake of breath. 9 boxes, out of how many? 32 total, based on what I could see when I got inside the coach. So you've recovered about 28%. Garrett's voice was carefully neutral, but Dusty could hear the excitement beneath it. Nearly $200,000 total. Mr. Vance, do you understand what this means? This isn't just the biggest find in territorial history. It's one of the most significant archaeological recoveries in the American West. It's money, Dusty said bluntly. Money I need. Money that could give me back my life. It's both, and that's why we need to do this right. Garrett joined him at the window. I meant what I said yesterday. I'm not your enemy. I want the story, yes, but I also want to see this resolved fairly. You found it. You should benefit from it, but trying to keep it all will destroy you. The weight of that secret, the constant fear, the impossibility of spending it without raising questions. It'll eat you alive. Dusty thought about the past weeks, the sleepless nights, the paranoia that had become his constant companion. Garrett was right about the weight. Each strong box he'd pulled from the well had added not just physical burden, but psychological torment. How much wealth was worth your sanity? How much gold was worth never being able to trust anyone or anything again? I need guarantees, Dusty said. I need to know this won't end with me in chains and the government taking everything. I can't guarantee the outcome. No one can. But I can guarantee that working within the law gives you the best chance, and I can guarantee that I'll stand by you through the process. My reputation is built on integrity, Mr. Vance. I won't sacrifice that for any amount of gold. They stood in silence for a long moment, two men from completely different worlds, connected by an accident of history and a hole in the ground that held more than either of them could have imagined. Finally, Dusty extended his hand. 60-40 split, full documentation, legal representation paid for by my share. And if anything goes wrong, if the government tries to take more than 40% or prosecute me for salvaging, you walk away with nothing. Deal? Garrett shook his hand firmly. Deal. When can I see the strong boxes you've recovered? Tonight, after dark. No one can know about this yet. Agreed. And tomorrow we start the recovery of the rest. The sooner we have a complete inventory, the sooner we can begin the legal process. Garrett returned to the table and began organizing his papers. This is going to change your life, Mr. Vance. I hope you're ready. Dusty looked out the window again at the town that had mocked him, at the people who'd called him the Baron of Dust and laughed at his inheritance. Soon they'd know the truth. Soon the homeless drifter would become the man who'd solved one of the territory's greatest mysteries. But first, he had 23 more strong boxes to retrieve. First, he had to finish what he'd started in the darkness of that ancient well. First, he had to trust a stranger with everything he had, and hope that trust wasn't the biggest mistake of his life. The work of recovering the remaining 23 strong boxes took another 3 weeks, but now Dusty had help. Garrett proved surprisingly capable with rope and tools, and his presence made the labor less isolating. They worked in shifts during the night, one man descending into the well while the other kept watch and managed the pulley system they'd rigged to make hauling easier. By the end of the 3rd week, all 32 strong boxes sat in the cave where Dusty had hidden the first 9. They'd photographed each one, documented the serial numbers stamped on their lids, and verified the contents. $320 gold pieces per box, without variation. $192,000 in 1879 gold, plus whatever premium collectors would pay for coins in such remarkable condition. Garrett's lawyer arrived from Tucson on a Tuesday morning, a thin man named Haskell who dressed like an undertaker and spoke with the precise diction of someone who'd spent his life parsing legal language. He examined their documentation, took statements from both Dusty and Garrett, and spent an afternoon studying the well and the surrounding property. "This is solid," Haskell said, standing in the shack with papers spread across Dusty's makeshift table. Clear chain of ownership, legitimate salvage claim, extensive documentation of the find. The Army will push back, they always do, but salvage law is on your side. After 45 years of abandonment, their claim is weak. How long before we hear from them? Dusty asked. I filed the official claim yesterday. The Territorial Governor's office will receive it within a week. They'll forward it to the War Department, which will assign investigators. Figure 6 to 8 weeks before anyone shows up. Haskell adjusted his spectacles. In the meantime, we wait. Don't spend anything. Don't move the gold. Don't talk to anyone about this outside our immediate circle. The waiting was harder than the physical labor had been. Dusty continued living in the shack, maintaining the appearance of poverty while sitting on a fortune. The town's mockery continued, and now it carried a bitter irony that Dusty could barely endure. Each time someone called him the Baron of Dust, he had to bite back the truth that wanted to burst from his throat. Garrett remained in Copper Ridge, renting a room at the hotel and spending his days writing what he promised would be the definitive account of the ghost coach discovery. He shared chapters with Dusty as he completed them, and Dusty found himself fascinated by the way Garrett wove together history and mystery, making the dry facts come alive with speculation and narrative drive. 6 weeks after the claim was filed, the telegram arrived. Dusty was at the general store buying his meager weekly supplies when Hoskins called out to him. Got a telegram for you, Baron. Must be important. Came from the Territorial Governor's office. The store fell silent. Telegrams were expensive and rare, reserved for urgent business or terrible news. Dusty took the folded paper with hands that he forced to remain steady. aware that every eye in the store was watching him. He read it once, then again to be sure he understood. To Elias Vance. Stop salvage claim acknowledged. Stop Army representatives en route. Copper Ridge. Stop expect arrival. 1 week. Stop maintain security of site. Stop cooperate fully with investigation. Stop signed Governor Murphy. Stop. Everything all right? Hoskins asked, his curiosity barely concealed. Family business, Dusty said, folding the telegram and putting it in his pocket. Nothing important. But it was everything important. The government had responded. They were sending people. The wheels of bureaucracy were turning, and soon Dusty's secret would become public knowledge. Soon the Baron of Dust would be revealed as the man who'd found nearly $200,000 in lost Army gold. He paid for his supplies and walked quickly back to the property, his mind racing. 1 week. In 1 week, everything would change. The investigation would be thorough, probably invasive. They'd want to examine the well, the coach, every strongbox. They'd verify his claim, certainly, but they'd also look for any reason to dispute it, to argue that he'd hidden evidence or failed to report the find promptly or somehow violated the terms of proper salvage. Garrett was waiting at the shack when Dusty arrived. The historian took one look at his face and said, "They responded." Dusty handed him the telegram. Garrett read it, nodded slowly, and smiled. "This is good. They acknowledged the claim. That means they're taking it seriously. If they wanted to simply seize everything, they wouldn't have bothered with official communication. They're coming to negotiate, or to arrest me." No. Haskell was clear. Filing the claim first protects you legally. You're not a thief who got caught. You're a salvager who followed proper procedures. There's a huge difference in the eyes of the law. Garrett handed back the telegram. 1 week. We use that time to prepare. Make sure every document is in order, every photograph properly labeled, every piece of evidence beyond dispute. When they arrive, we show them a case so solid they have no choice but to honor the salvage agreement. Dusty looked out at the well, that ancient circle of stones that had become the axis around which his life now revolved. 1 week until the army arrived. 1 week until his secret became public. 1 week until he learned whether he'd found salvation or simply discovered a more elaborate way to lose everything. The Army representatives arrived on schedule, 3 men in uniform accompanied by a territorial marshal and a government accountant. Their leader was a colonel named Braxton, a man in his 50s with gray at his temples and the bearing of someone who'd spent his career making difficult decisions. They gathered at the property on a cloudless morning, standing in a semicircle around the well while Braxton examined Haskell's documentation. The colonel read in silence for nearly 20 minutes, occasionally making notes in a small leather journal. The others waited patiently, their faces giving nothing away. Finally, Braxton looked up at Dusty. "Mr. Vance, I've reviewed your salvage claim and the supporting evidence provided by Mr. Garrett. The documentation is thorough and appears legitimate. However, before we proceed further, I need to examine the site and verify the existence of what you claim to have found." "Of course," Dusty said. His voice was steady despite the fear churning in his gut. "The well is here. The coach is at the bottom, approximately 60 feet down. The strong boxes have been removed for security, but can be produced for verification." "Security," Braxton repeated. "An interesting word choice. Some might call it concealment. I called it survival," Dusty replied. "I'm a homeless man who stumbled onto something valuable. Leaving it in an open well would have been an invitation for theft." Braxton's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Perhaps respect, perhaps merely acknowledgement. "Fair point. Let's examine the well." The descent took 2 hours. Braxton insisted on going down himself, accompanied by the territorial marshal. Dusty and Garrett waited above with the others, listening to the muffled voices echoing up from below. When the 2 men finally emerged, both were covered in dirt and sweat, and Braxton was holding something, a piece of wood bearing the faded letters, U.S. Army. "It's there," Braxton said simply. "The coach is intact, mostly. The roof has been breached, presumably by Mr. Vance during his initial discovery. The interior shows no signs of looting beyond the removed strong boxes." He turned to Dusty. "I'll need to see those boxes now." The walk to the cave took 30 minutes. Dusty led them along the path he'd memorized during those long nights of hauling gold, aware that every step was being observed, and judged. When they reached the cave and he pulled aside the brush concealing the entrance, he heard one of the soldiers whistle softly. 32 strong boxes, stacked carefully in rows, each one still bearing its army identification markings. The government accountant stepped forward and began his work immediately, opening boxes at random and counting their contents. 2 hours later, he reported his findings to Braxton. All 32 boxes are present and accounted for. Each contains $320 gold pieces for a total of 9,600 coins. Current value at face denomination, $192,000. Market value for coins in this condition, potentially twice that amount or more. Braxton nodded slowly. And Mr. Vance had access to these boxes for how long before filing his claim? 3 weeks from initial discovery to filing, Haskell answered, during which time he could have taken any number of coins, melted them down, or hidden them elsewhere. Yet the count is exact. Not a single coin is missing. The colonel looked at Dusty with new assessment. That shows remarkable restraint for a man in your circumstances. I'm not a thief, Dusty said quietly. I found something that wasn't mine, and I followed the law to claim it properly. All I want is what's fair. Braxton returned his attention to the documentation. He conferred quietly with the accountant and the marshal, their voices too low to hear clearly. The sun climbed higher, the temperature rising, and still they talked. Dusty felt sweat running down his back. Whether from heat or fear, he couldn't tell. Finally, Braxton approached Dusty and Garrett together. Gentlemen, I have made my decision. This claim is legitimate and will be honored according to the salvage contract Mr. Haskell has presented. The government accepts 40%. You retain 60%. The gold will be transported to Fort Huachuca for official counting and storage, then transferred to a bank of your choosing for division according to the agreed terms. Dusty felt his knees go weak. He'd expected more resistance, more arguments, more reasons why he couldn't have what he'd found. Instead, Braxton was extending his hand in what could only be interpreted as respect. The Army doesn't forget its debts, Braxton said as they shook. This payroll has been on our books as lost for 45 years. Recovering even 40% is a victory. You did good work here, Mr. Vance. Both of you. Garrett was grinning, unable to contain his excitement. When can we expect the transfer? 6 weeks for the counting and verification, 8 weeks for the banking arrangements. By the end of October, you'll have your money. Braxton looked around at the harsh landscape, the dry scrubland that had seemed so worthless. Sometimes the best treasures are hidden in the most unlikely places. You just have to be desperate enough, or foolish enough, to dig deep enough to find them. As the colonel and his men began the work of transporting the strong boxes back to town, Dusty stood beside the well and felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the certain knowledge that everything was going to be all right. 3 months later, Elias Vance stood in the lobby of the Copper Ridge Bank and signed the papers that transferred $115,200 into an account bearing his name. The bank president, a man who'd previously refused to acknowledge Dusty's existence, now shook his hand with genuine enthusiasm and assured him of the institution's complete discretion and excellent service. The town had transformed in its treatment of him the moment news of the discovery became public. The mockery had turned to deference, the laughter to congratulations, but Dusty found he had little interest in their changed attitudes. Their respect now felt hollow compared to the quiet dignity of men like Samuel Pritchard, who'd seen him as human even when he had nothing. Pritchard was waiting outside the bank when Dusty emerged, leaning on his cane and whittling another of his wooden birds. He looked up and nodded as Dusty approached. "I heard you're leaving," the old man said. "California. I have a daughter there. Haven't seen her in 7 years." Dusty sat down beside him. "I wrote her a letter, told her I was coming, told her I'd made something of myself. Don't know if she'll want to see me, but I have to try. She'll see you. Daughters always do eventually. Takes them longer to forgive than sons, but when they do, it sticks." Pritchard held up his latest carving, a hawk this time, wings spread in flight. "This one's for you, for the journey." Dusty took the wooden bird and turned it in his hands. The detail was extraordinary, every feather individually defined, the fierce eyes seeming almost alive. "Thank you. I'll treasure it. Remember what I told you about gold getting heavier the longer you carry it? Pritchard put away his knife. You did the right thing. Could have run, could have tried to keep it all. But you chose the honest path, and now you can walk with your head up. That's worth more than all the gold in that well. I had help. Garrett kept me honest. No, you kept yourself honest. Garrett just gave you a way to do it legally. The old man stood slowly, joints creaking. Now you go find that daughter and show her the man you've become. Don't apologize for the past. Just show her the future. They shook hands, and Dusty walked back to what he still thought of as his uncle's property one last time. The shack was being torn down tomorrow. He'd sold the land to a mining company for a fair price, and they wanted to start operations immediately. They believed the well might connect to underground water sources that could serve their operations. Dusty hadn't told them about the coach still resting at the bottom. The army had decided it was too dangerous and expensive to retrieve, declaring it an archaeological site to be properly excavated at a future date. Let the miners discover it themselves if they wanted. Garrett was already there, packing up his equipment and organizing his notes. His book was finished and would be published in the spring by a Boston press. The advance he'd received wasn't substantial, but the attention the story had generated had brought offers for speaking engagements and university positions. He was leaving for the East Coast at the end of the week. Strange to think it all started here, Garrett said, looking at the well, with a homeless man desperate enough to climb into a dry hole. Sometimes desperation is just another word for hope, Dusty replied. You hope there's something better if you just dig deep enough. And sometimes there is. Garrett extended his hand. I've made my career on this story, but you've made your life. I think you got the better end of the deal. They shook hands, and Dusty felt genuine gratitude. Without Garrett's knowledge and connections, the gold would have destroyed him one way or another. With it, he'd been able to claim his second chance legally and honestly. What will you do with it all? Garrett asked. The money, I mean. First, I'm going to California to see my daughter. If she'll have me, I'll buy a house near her family. If she won't, I'll buy one anyway and hope she changes her mind. Dusty looked out at the land that had seemed so worthless when he arrived. Then I'm going to live quietly. No grand plans, no big investments. Just a regular life. The kind I lost and thought I'd never have again. That's it. No dreams of wealth and luxury. I've been wealthy and I've been homeless. Turns out what I really want is somewhere in between. Enough to be comfortable. Not so much that I lose sight of what matters. Dusty pulled out the gold coin he'd been carrying since that first day, the one he'd examined in the shack while deciding whether to report his find or run with it. I'm keeping this one, though, as a reminder of what? That sometimes the worst thing that happens to you is preparation for the best thing that could happen to you. I had to lose everything before I could appreciate finding anything. As the sun began to set over the Arizona territory, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber, Dusty took one last look at the well that had changed his life. The stone circle stood as solid as it had for half a century, a testament to the craftsmanship of men who'd believed in building things to last. His uncle Jeremiah had been right in a way. The land had held value beyond imagining. Just not the kind anyone expected. Not silver or copper or even water, but gold hidden beneath layers of earth and time, waiting for someone desperate enough to look. Dusty touched the brim of his hat in a silent salute to his uncle, to the soldiers who'd guarded that payroll so long ago, to the mysteries of chance and circumstance that had led him to this moment. Then he turned away from the well and walked toward the road that led to town, to the train that would carry him west, to the daughter who waited whether she knew it or not. The Baron of Dust was leaving Arizona, but Elias Vance, father, heir, and honest man, was finally going home.